Picture this: the battlefield outside Nancy in January 1477. Snow so heavy it muffles even the dying groans. A white silence smeared red, where knights once screamed. The cannons have fallen quiet now, and the wind carries only the rattle of armor sinking into mud. Look closely through the drifting flakes, and you'll find him, half buried in slush and blood, a figure who once marched, dressed like a knight out of legend, now naked, stiff, and gnawed. This is Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, the man who dared to carve a kingdom between France and the Holy Roman Empire. The man so certain God had armored him in destiny, he mistook pride for holiness. And yet, here he lies, not crowned in glory, but scattered in pieces for wolves to chew. You were never supposed to picture him this way. History likes to remember him as a bold knight, not as frozen carrion whose own men abandoned him. So follow me into the snow, and I will show you what the chronicles buried. But before we get into it, don't forget to subscribe. To understand why Charles ended up face down in a swamp, you have to start decades earlier, with a boy born in 1433 to Philip the Good, one of the richest men in Europe. Burgundy wasn't some dusty backwater. It was the glittering prize of Northern Europe, straddling what is now France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Silk markets, gold leaf manuscripts, feasts that would make Paris blush. Charles grew up believing this wealth was his birthright, and believing it gave him destiny. They called him Charles the Bold, le téméraire. Bold was polite. Reckless was closer to the truth whispered in council halls. He wasn't content to be duke. He wanted to be king, maybe even something greater, a restorer of the medieval dream of knighthood. Imagine that, clinging to mounted charges and plate armor just as gunpowder was rewriting the rules of war. While France and the Swiss were drilling disciplined pike squares and hauling artillery across mountains, Charles was still sketching banners and perfecting cavalry drills, convinced courage could outmatch cannon. And here's where it gets darker. His father, Philip the Good, had built Burgundy through diplomacy, bribes, and lavish courtly displays. Soft power, if you like. Charles sneered at that. He believed steel and faith were enough. Chroniclers like Philippe de Comines, who knew him personally, described him as austere and almost monk-like in private, yet obsessed with personal honor to the point of madness. It wasn't just ambition. It was a crusade inside his own skull. By the 1470s, Burgundy sat between two giants, France under Louis XI and the Holy Roman Empire under Frederick III. And Charles wanted to carve out a kingdom between them, a chivalric buffer state that would let him play arbiter of Europe. But every dream needs an enemy, and Charles found his in the Swiss Confederation and René II of Lorraine. The Swiss weren't glamorous knights. They were farmers with pikes, hardened by mountain winters and used to killing aristocrats in tidy lines. Charles marched into Switzerland in 1476, expecting an easy win. Instead, he met disaster at Granson in March, where Swiss infantry shattered his pride and seized his treasures, wagons of gold, jeweled goblets, even his personal tapestries. 3 months later, in June 1476, Morat, another slaughter. Burgundian knights cut down in mud, cannon fire drowning their charges. Contemporary reports describe Charles walking the corpse-strewn field after Morat, muttering prayers and weeping openly, vowing that he would rather die than endure such shame again. This is where the spiral begins. By winter of 1476, Charles was isolated, paranoid, his forces thinned by desertion and starvation. Allies abandoned him. He began to interpret every setback as divine testing. He believed his failures weren't warnings to change strategy, but trials meant to prove his worth. It is the kind of logic that ends in blood. And so, as the snow began to fall, Charles set his eyes on Nancy, the key to Lorraine, preparing for what he swore would be his last gamble. But what he didn't know was that this gamble wouldn't just end Burgundy. It would turn him into a warning, a frozen corpse remembered less for victory and more for the way wolves gnawed his legacy. And if you think you've heard the worst, stay with me. The battle itself, the collapse, the desperate last stand, that's where the real horror begins. In January 1477, the snow outside Nancy was waist-deep, the kind that muffles cannon fire until it feels like the world itself is holding its breath. Charles had only about 12,000 men left, hungry, ragged, and exhausted. René II of Lorraine was coming for him with nearly double that number, reinforced by Swiss pikemen and French artillery. No one wrote ballads about this part. A starving army, surrounded in hostile territory, waiting in the freezing dark for an attack they knew they couldn't stop. Charles camped outside the city walls, desperate to break the siege. Supplies were gone. Horses were dying where they stood. Chroniclers write of soldiers stripping bark from trees to boil into broth, of tents collapsing under snow so heavy it silenced the night. And above all, there was Charles himself, refusing to accept reality, still clinging to knightly honor like it could somehow shield him from lead shot. On January 5th, the storm broke. Not just the weather, but the battle. René's forces came in waves, Swiss pikes in tight formation, Alsatian infantry hammering at the flanks, French guns firing from the hills. Burgundian cavalry, the pride of Charles's army, found themselves sinking in snow and mud, their charges broken by pike walls bristling like frozen hedges. There are accounts of horses impaled, 2, 3 at a time, men screaming as they were dragged under by their own mounts. And Charles? He refused to flee. Comines, who chronicled the campaign, swore he saw Charles fight to the last, sword in hand, screaming curses, vanishing into the melee. Other reports place him at a swampy hollow near Saint-Jean, surrounded, cut down not by noble duel but by halberds swung by Swiss peasants. His jeweled armor was stripped from his body immediately. When the snow settled, no one could even find him. That night, the battlefield froze. The dead were left where they fell. Wolves descended first, then dogs from the nearby villages, gnawing on the flesh of knights and peasants alike. By morning, Burgundian banners lay trampled into blood-soaked slush, their bright reds indistinguishable from the gore beneath. And here's the bitter irony. Charles had dreamed of eternal glory, yet in death he was unrecognizable. 2 days later, René's men found a bloated corpse half buried in ice, face mutilated, one leg chewed away. The only way they knew it was Charles was a crooked scar along his jaw and the broken nose he'd carried since boyhood. The Duke, who once wore armor gilded in gold, was now identified, like a common vagrant, by his wounds, not his titles. Contemporaries called it divine justice. Pamphlets spread through Europe painting his death as punishment for pride. In France, they celebrated him as a fool undone by his own arrogance. In Swiss taverns, they raised toasts to the farmers who felled a duke. And in Burgundy, silence, the shock of watching a living myth reduced to carrion. Think about that. The man who sought to rival kings ended up food for wolves. And if you think that's the worst part, hold on. Because what happened to his corpse afterward, the propaganda, the public display, the humiliation that followed, makes this battle look almost merciful. 2 days after the battle, a scavenger's clue betrayed where Charles lay. Crows circling low over the snow, a patch of trampled ice stained black instead of red. Soldiers approached cautiously, as if the body itself carried a curse, and when they uncovered him, even hardened veterans stepped back in silence. What they found wasn't a duke, not even a man, just frozen meat, gnawed and swollen, his face half gone, his fine hair stiff with ice. Contemporary chroniclers couldn't even agree on how he died. Some swore he fell by a halberd, others that he drowned in the swamp trying to crawl away. But none of them forgot what his body looked like when they finally saw it. Ears missing, jaw mangled, one eye pecked out by birds. It was winter's own autopsy, nature stripping away the myths Charles had spent a lifetime building. And here's the part you weren't supposed to dwell on. His armor, stolen by looters, reappeared months later in Swiss villages, broken up and sold for parts. Some Swiss peasants claimed to drink from his goblets. Others bragged of wearing Burgundian mail on feast days as trophies. The man who wanted to be remembered as Europe's greatest knight became a set of souvenirs scattered across enemy homes. But humiliation didn't end with looters. René of Lorraine, triumphant, needed a spectacle, proof that the mighty were not invincible. The body was cleaned, displayed, and buried publicly. Less an act of respect than a statement. Chroniclers compared it to biblical judgment, casting Charles as Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea, undone by divine wrath. French pamphlets mocked him as the bold fool, celebrating his downfall as if God himself had personally chosen sides. And yet, in Burgundy, silence. A once mighty duchy, suddenly leaderless, heirless, except for a teenage girl. Soldiers who survived Nancy whispered of the shame, how their knightly duke ended up frozen in mud, picked apart by wolves. It was more than defeat. It was psychological annihilation. Imagine serving under a man who promised invincibility, then seeing him reduced to carrion. Would you still believe in the code he fought for? The trauma rippled outward. The Burgundian dream of chivalry died with him. Knights who survived carried memories not of banners and trumpets, but of comrades clubbing each other in roots, of scavenger birds circling before the battle was even done. It wasn't just Charles who was humiliated. It was the very idea of knighthood. And here's the darker part. The propaganda worked. His enemies didn't just win the battle, they rewrote the narrative. By the time news spread through Europe, Charles wasn't a tragic hero. He was a cautionary tale. Pride punished, boldness turned to madness. The story you inherited, centuries later, was already shaped by those who hated him. Which brings us to what happened next, and it's somehow even worse. Because Charles's death wasn't just the end of a man, it was the end of Burgundy itself, a duchy torn apart and devoured by larger powers that had been circling like those wolves all along. The body was barely cold before the scavengers descended. And I don't mean wolves this time, I mean kings. Because Charles left no son, only Mary of Burgundy, 19 years old, barely more than a pawn in the eyes of Europe's predators. The Duchy of Burgundy, richer than many kingdoms, straddling modern France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, instantly became the juiciest prize in Christendom. And like vultures circling carrion, everyone came picking. Louis XI of France struck first. Nicknamed the Spider King for good reason, he spun webs of intrigue faster than armies could march. Within days of Charles's death at Nancy in January 1477, French troops poured across Burgundian borders, seizing cities in Artois and Picardy, the official line. He was reclaiming lands that had technically been French thieves. The unofficial truth, he smelled blood, and Burgundy was undefended. You can almost hear him whisper, "Bold? Let's see how bold they are now." Meanwhile, Mary, barely crowned duchess, faced a nightmare most medieval princesses feared: marry fast or lose everything. Her advisors, desperate, arranged a match with Maximilian of Austria, the future Holy Roman Emperor, cementing a Habsburg alliance. Picture it. A marriage less about love than geography, forged under the shadow of her father's half-eaten corpse. Want a dowry? How about an entire kingdom in crisis? This union would change Europe forever. Overnight, Burgundy's vast lands fused with the Habsburg domains, creating a superpower stretching from Spain to the Low Countries. And France? furious. Louis XI went from celebrating victory at Nancy to decades of bitter wars against the Habsburgs. If you're wondering why Europe spent the next 2 centuries tearing itself apart in the Habsburg-Valois rivalry, this snow-soaked battlefield is where the spark was lit. But here's what nobody tells you in the clean versions. Burgundy didn't just vanish into empires. It was carved apart like a carcass, with rival claimants haggling over border towns while the people who lived there starved. Local chroniclers described entire villages switching rulers 3 times in a year, taxes tripling each time. One merchant from Ghent wrote bitterly, "We buried him in snow, but they buried us in debt." Dark, but not wrong. And yet, the propaganda machine kept spinning. French poets turned Charles into a moral fable. Pride punished, arrogance humbled. Swiss chronicles bragged about peasant pikemen killing a duke, a tale of humble righteousness. Burgundian loyalists whispered a different story, half forbidden. That Charles had been betrayed, that someone in his ranks sold him out at Nancy, that the mutilation of his body wasn't just wolves but men, enemies, and perhaps former friends taking trophies. You won't find that line in royal chronicles, but it lingers in private letters, like a rumor too ugly to publish, but too satisfying to kill. And here's where the humor sharpens to a razor edge. The man who dreamed of resurrecting medieval knighthood, of crowning himself a king among kings, ended up as a punchline at feasts. French soldiers toasted with cups engraved, "The Bold Fool," and Swiss farmers used Burgundian plate for feeding pigs. Imagine dying to preserve your honor, only for your enemies to eat stew out of your heirlooms. So the duchy collapsed. Mary's marriage reshaped Europe, and Charles's dream dissolved into history's footnotes, a cautionary tale buried under layers of propaganda and bone-deep snow. And if you think the story ends here, it doesn't. Because what died at Nancy wasn't just a man or a duchy. It was the medieval world itself, cracking under the weight of gunpowder, mercenary armies, and royal treasuries fattened by taxes. Chivalry didn't fade gently. It froze, bled, and got eaten by wolves. And so, in the snowdrifts outside Nancy, the last great Duke of Burgundy vanished, not in legend, but in rot. Charles the Bold, who dreamed of reviving knighthood, who charged cannon fire as if banners and prayers could stop gunpowder, ended, stripped, frozen, and gnawed by wolves. His empire died with him, swallowed in days by France and Austria, fueling wars that would rage for centuries. Official histories dressed it up as divine judgment, the fall of a proud tyrant. But if you dig deeper, beneath the court poets and victory murals, you find whispers of betrayal, of scavenged armor traded in back alleys, of soldiers who saw not God's justice but man's greed. It was not morality that killed Burgundy. It was politics. It was hunger. It was snow hiding blood until the thaw. Think about that next time you hear someone wax nostalgic about chivalry. This is how the knightly dream actually ended, face down in a swamp, turned carrion for peasants and beasts alike. Thank you for watching. If you want more of these buried truths, subscribe now and click the video on the screen, because this was only one corpse in the snow, and history is littered with them. The question is, how many more have they buried where you will never look?